Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My group members and I are going to present our problem-solving assignment under the topic nuisance for scenario number 6. And as you can see on the screen, these are our group members.
In question 6, there are two parties in this scenario, which is the first one is the plaintiff, which is Harold, and the second one is the defendant, which is Chris. There are two legal issues in this case. The first one is whether Harold has a right to file an action for private nuisance against his neighbor Chris arising from an incident of natural hazard occurring from Chris' land which he has failed to address. The second legal issue is whether Chris owed a duty of care towards his neighbor, Harold, to take reasonable steps to abate danger.
Next, we move on to the elements of nuisance. Based on the scenario, this case can be classified as private nuisance under the tort of nuisance. In order to succeed in a claim for private nuisance action, the plaintiff has to prove to the court three elements of private nuisance, and the first one is an indirect interference with the enjoyment of land. In the scenario given, we can see that the plaintiff is the house owner located at the base of the hill, not far from the defendant's land. Over a long period of time, soil and rubble had continuously fallen from the bank onto the plaintiff's properties and onto his land as a result of the natural weathering. After a very dry summer, a large crack had opened up in the bank above the plaintiff's house, and he notified and alerted the defendant to the danger of a major collapse of the bank onto his property. The defendant was aware of the danger but denied any responsibility for the danger, and arguing that it was an entirely natural process. And some weeks later, there was a large fall of the bank onto the land belonging to the plaintiff. And based on the fact, we can say that the loss of full enjoyment to the land suffered by the plaintiff was due to the defendant's failure to take any precautions and reasonable steps to stop the issue from happening, even though he already knew the risk. Even though the nuisance was caused by naturally arising hazards, the defendant was still considered liable for nuisance provided that he was aware of the existence of danger and failed to take reasonable precautions. So the defendant's failure to take any precautions constitute an indirect interference with the enjoyment of plaintiff's land. There are two cases we refer to as reference. The first one is the case of Leakey and others and National Trust for Places of Historic Interest or Natural Beauty. This case has a very similar facts to the scenario given. From this case, it was held that defendants were liable in nuisance and damages were awarded to the plaintiff. This case shows that the defendant was indeed liable even though the damage was caused by natural processes. The fact that he noticed and failed to take reasonable steps to prevent it from happening fulfilled the elements of nuisance, namely the indirect interference with the enjoyment of the land. The other case that also applied the same rule is Goldman and Hargrave and others. A tree on the defendant's land was struck by lightning and caught fire. The following morning, the defendant contacted a tree feller to cut down the tree saw into sections. The tree wood was still smoldering and the defendant failed to douse it with water to eliminate the risk of fire. Over the next few days, the weather became very hot and reignited the fire, which spread to neighboring property. The defendant was liable for the naturally occurring danger that arose on his land, as he was aware of danger and failed to act with reasonable action to remove the hazard. From both of the cases, we can conclude that where a naturally occurring hazard arises on the defendant's land, principles of negligence are relevant to nuisance. In short, the defendant's failure to take any precautions to prevent foreseeable natural disasters constitutes an indirect interference with the enjoyment of plaintiff's land.
The second element of nuisance is the interference was unreasonable. The use of land or property in a way which forcibly interfere with the claimant's quiet enjoyment of their own land. Specifically, nuisance is an injury caused by unreasonable interference with the use of land. Based on Slater and Worthington's cash stores case, the defending property owner was held to be liable for failing to remove the snow from his roof, which had accumulated there through unusually severe storms. Consequently, a minor fall of snow injured a passerby on the pavement. This case showed that the interference was unreasonable because the defendant did nothing to abate the foreseeable danger which had caused injury to others. To be actionable, the interference with the enjoyment of land must be substantial. In this case, the defendant's failure of removing the snow that had caused the injury to the plaintiff constituted an unreasonable. The last element of nuisance is the interference had caused damage to the claimant. A person who suffers interference with the enjoyment of his land or property due to the actions of another person can sue the wrongdoer to put an end to the interference in the form of an injunction, and to also claim damages against the wrongdoer. The interference can be in various forms, including noise, sight, smell, vibration, fumes, smoke, ashes, dust, debris, or physical invasion or obstruction. In this case, the damage is yet to happen. However, it is crystal clear that the plaintiffs will suffer loss due to the natural process of erosion if the defendant continues to deny his responsibility to mitigate or abate the danger.
So next, I will be presenting the one available remedy for the plaintiff. So after referring to some cases and also doing some analysis, I found out that the available remedy for the plaintiff is damages. So what is damages? So damages in tort law is a type of compensation given to a victim by the tortfeasor. So the tortfeasor is the person who is responsible for the tortious activity. So to recover a damages, a person must demonstrate that he has been injured, whereby his legal right have been violated. So this is based on the maxim injuria sine damno, which is it means that there is a legal injury without any actual damage. So the injured party has a right to recover the damages if he can prove that his legal right is violated, even though he does not suffer from any loss. So he can claim for the damages as long as there is a violation of legal right. So he does not necessarily need to prove that there have been some injury. So he only need to prove to the court that there are some violation of the legal right. I will explain about the damages in the scenario. So in this scenario, the plaintiff is entitled to recover damages because he suffered violation of legal right. So the plaintiff is said to be suffering from violation of legal right because the defendant constitute private nuisance. So there is an indirect interference with the enjoyment of the plaintiff's land because Chris, the defendant, refuses to take any precaution steps to stop the major collapse of the bank onto the claimant house, even though the risk is totally foreseeable and the plaintiff already informed the defendant regarding the risk. So this shows that the defendant is liable for nuisance and has infringed the plaintiff's legal right. So therefore, the plaintiff has the right to make a damages claim in the court. There are two cases that we refer to. So the first one is Leakey and others and National Trust for Places of Historic Interest or Natural Beauty. So what happened in this case is the plaintiff were entitled to recover damages because the court found that the defendant was liable for nuisance and infringed the plaintiff's legal right as they were suffering from the loss of enjoyment of the land. So the fact of this case is actually quite similar to the scenario assigned to us, which is why I decided that one available remedy for the plaintiff is damages. So the second case is Slater and Nuisance Cash Stores 1930 Limited. So what happened in this case is the plaintiff was injured from a fall from the roof of the premises of snow which had accumulated there through unusually
unusually severe storms. So the defendant was held liable for nuisance for failing to remove the snow from his roof, and he had done nothing to abate it. So the plaintiff was entitled to recover the damages, which is general damages and also special damages.
And now I will present about one possible argument or defense by the defendant. Okay, so the defendant, Chris, can escape from his liability for nuisance by defending himself with the doctrine act of God. Okay, so it is an act that is directly or exclusively due to natural causes without the human intervention, and that it could not have been prevented by any amount of foresight, pains, or care reasonably expected of Chris, the defendant. When the act or omission complained of was the result of a natural disaster or another unforeseeable or uncontrollable circumstance, an act of God can provide a defense in the tort action. So when something happens as a result of an act of God, a party cannot be held liable because the act was not done intentionally or negligently. By applying the doctrine act of God in this scenario, the defendant can argue that he has no obligation to do something to prevent something bad from happening to the plaintiff property because it is caused by the natural movement of the earth. It is entirely a natural process, and the defendant does not do anything which may constitute the nuisance faced by the plaintiff. Due to the unusual weather, there is a large fall of the bank onto the land belonging to the plaintiff, and it is obvious that the defendant does not do anything which may constitute the nuisance faced by the plaintiff. Hence, the defendant can contend that he is under no liability to the plaintiff to keep his land in, and that contention is found on the submission that where danger arises as a result of operations of nature on the land itself, as opposed to something on the land, no cause of action in nuisance lies against the occupier of the land where the danger arises. This means when something happens because of the act of God, the defendant shall be free from liability because he is not the cause which constitute the nuisance faced by the plaintiff. The defendant may rely on the case of Pontardawe Rural District Council and Moordrain, where the actual land had collapsed onto the plaintiff property. In this case, a large rock fell from the defendant's land onto the second plaintiff house. So the plaintiff brought an action claiming for an order requiring the defendant to abate what the local authority asserted was a nuisance on his land, namely the loose rocks up top. However, the defendant asserted that no cause of action lay because the rocks were natural and the defendant had done nothing whatsoever to cause them to be unstable. So the argument prevailed and the judgment was in favor of the defendant. So the decision made in this case can be used to support Chris to be free from liability of nuisance because it has similar material facts with the scenario between Harold and Chris. So I think that is all from us, and thank you for listening. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.